And here with us to digest the election results is Christine Forster, councillor at the City of Sydney, and Myriam Lyons, Renewables campaigner at GetUp, along with Paula Matthewson, political columnist at The New Daily. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Christine Forster, I want to start with you. This result took some people in your party by surprise, particularly if you would have told them this would be the result early on in the campaign. How are you digesting what went right for the Liberal campaign?
Well, certainly you're right. I think everybody was a bit surprised, and that was because of the polling. The polling had been consistently showing that we were in a losing position for the last 3 years. So,
well, it turned around, didn't it, in the last week?
Well, the last news poll said that there was a 1.9% swing against the Liberals.
The internal polling, I mean, the internal Liberal polling.
Oh, the internal Liberal polling I'm not privy to. But certainly what went right was the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, fought a fantastic campaign. He stayed on message. He consistently pointed out that what Labor was offering was big spending, big taxing government, and people weren't prepared to trust them with it.
Paula Matthewson, let's bring you in now. That negative campaign, it worked remarkably well for the coalition, didn't it?
It did. And Morrison was a one-man campaign machine. He stuck to that message and just prosecuted it over and over again, making sure that he finally pressed all of the buttons of the voters who just weren't sure about Bill Shorten, a little bit anxious about him, not really sure whether he was the right way to go. And so because they felt comfortable with Morrison, they chose the devil they knew.
Myriam Lyons, how are you digesting this result, given that GetUp also tried to push voters' buttons in a different way and it just didn't work?
So, I mean, it certainly worked in Warringah, where now somebody who had been in for 25 years, a former Prime Minister, has not just lost his seat but lost in a landslide. And I put that down to a great extent, a very large contributing factor, the fact that our volunteers were out there knocking on over 25,000 doors, talking to people face to face about the issues they cared about.
Greater than Warringah, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were certainly working in a number of seats, and you know, it's sad that in several of those seats, although we were able to hold the tide against a broader swing where a lot of different factors were going on, certainly there wasn't that same dramatic result as we saw in Warringah. But certainly in Warringah, the presence was actually far greater. So, for example, our volunteers knocked on more than twice as many doors in Warringah compared to Dixon, made a lot more phone calls as well, and in other seats there was no door knocking going on at all. It was just the phone calls. And in several of those seats, for example, Dixon, I mean, Dutton would have a safe seat right now, I believe, if it were not for that campaign. The swing in Dixon was far less than the neighbouring seat in Petrie, for example, and a great deal less than the overall.
He still had a 6% swing towards him when the talk ahead of Saturday was that he would lose his seat.
So I believe it was a 2% swing towards him at the latest count, and the statewide swing was something in the order of 5%. The neighbouring seat of Petrie, I think, was around 6%. So certainly we believe that our volunteers having those heartfelt conversations with their fellow voters about the issues that they cared about and connecting on those issues was impactful in this campaign. But obviously our members, cared about a whole lot of issues in this election. Action on climate change was obviously a foremost concern for our members, a very big concern for many people across the community that did not translate into the election result. I think a lot of questions will be asked about why many people who care deeply about the climate voted on other issues. But, obviously for the Labor Party, they will be having many internal discussions about what went wrong with their campaign. But as an outsider, it certainly seems to me that the problems were not with their policy offerings, their problems were with their pitch and their salesperson.
Christine Forster, even just seeing polling booths in the seat of Warringah, the Liberal volunteers were completely outnumbered, weren't they, by not just GetUp and Zali Steggall's volunteers, but as well as the Vote Tony Out group.
Yep.
Was it always going to be an uphill battle, even though he had an 11% margin in that seat?
Yeah, look, it was always going to be very tough, and the Wentworth by-election last October showed, how a sitting Liberal member could be knocked off, and they threw everything at Tony, as we've just heard. A lot of the resources that were going to be targeted at Peter Dutton ended up being targeted in Warringah. Absolutely everything was thrown at Tony in Warringah. you know, plainly there was a local groundswell of, there was a mood for change in Warringah after 25 years, and that contributed very much to the result as well, and Tony was aware of that. He took it on the chin. As he said on Saturday night, he'd rather be a loser than a quitter, and he was prepared to stay there and fight the good fight, and he did.
Could that have not been mitigated earlier on in the piece by coming to terms with the mood around climate change in the electorate of Warringah? I mean, he spoke in his concession speech about the Green left. Does that miss the point about climate change, that you can be concerned about climate change and still hold conservative values, which I think he sort of came around to eventually, but sort of seemed too late? Yeah,
well, and look, Tony has always been painted as the climate warrior, the anti-climate warrior, and that's not a perception that he could have changed in the run-up to this election. That was always going to stick. And of course everybody's concerned about the environment. What the argument is about, in my view, is how you respond to climate change. That's where the argument lies. And obviously in Warringah, as I said, there was a mood for change after 25 years. Tony couldn't change his perception quickly about his position on environment, and people would have thought him a fraud if he had. So he was true to himself, he was true to his principles, true to his convictions, and he fought the fight basically as he always has, as, you know, what you see is what you get with Tony Abbott.
One of the things that he said in his concession speech that I thought was significant, and it was a really compelling concession speech.
It was an extraordinary speech under the circumstances particularly.
And it hasn't had a lot of airplay in the news, was he said that there's a realignment of politics going on, that in working seats the coalition is doing better, and in wealthy seats, because of the Green left influence, the coalition is doing worse. How do you see that realignment of politics, and do you agree with Tony Abbott?
Well, certainly that's what happened in Wentworth last October and has been corrected now with Dave Sharma, who's a terrific candidate, winning the seat of Wentworth, and it's what happened in Warringah. But again, I think there was definitely a mood for change in Warringah. You could feel it. You know, I stood on a polling a booth all day, and there was, you know, people were definitely feeding back that it was time for a change. So, you know, I think those two electorates are probably, you know, they're a bit of an anomaly. I think it's true that the wealthier electorates are more concerned about climate change because they can afford to be. People who are just trying to get by can't afford to pay $1,000 extra on their power bills every year. They just can't. So it's easier for people in Wentworth and Warringah to be climate warriors.
Paula Matthewson, what's your response to that there is this realignment in politics going on, and in working class seats you saw a swing towards the coalition in seats that were previously marginal, they're now safe coalition seats?
Well, it's not, that aspect isn't actually new. John Howard was successful in capturing those same voters when he was in government. Back then they were called the Howard Battlers. And I don't think there's any mistake that Scott Morrison has modelled himself as the next John Howard, and has spent a lot of time talking to John Howard. And he said that he's done so, and has basically modelled his campaign in the same shape to influence those same voters. And it was, we're hearing now from the Labor leadership contenders that Labor has to come back from the left to the centre because they're the very people that have felt abandoned by Labor moving to the left on some of those issues. So it's new in a way, but it's not as well. So I think we need to take that into consideration, that it's maybe it's even a cyclical thing depending on the state of the economy, the state of the environment in terms of, do we have lots of droughts and floods? Are people thinking about the environment? Or do we have a good, strong economy and are people, really thinking about jobs, job security, cost of living, those sorts of issues?
Myriam, Lyons, I want to ask you about that question. Many people who were watching this election, people who were in the political game, described this as the climate change election. I want to play you a little clip here from Erica Betts speaking on AM this morning about why people didn't react to that. Let's have a listen to that.
can any policy do with a bit of retweaking from time to time? Of course it can, and let's see what comes up.
And that includes the idea of re-looking at the neg?
Well, look, our energy policy, I think, was stated very clearly, and I think the party room has made decisions in relation to that, but I'm not going to put a name on it as whether it's the neg or something else. Clearly, our country needs a further developed, very good energy policy.
So a further developed energy policy, by association climate policy as well, but he described this as being allegedly, in his words, the climate change election, and people just did not warm to that from Bill Shorten. Why is that?
Well, look, the reality is that every election is going to be a climate change election until, in Paddy Manning's words, a safer climate wins. Right? Climate change is here. We are already at a level of greenhouse gases now that in Earth's past history has led to 2 to 4 degrees of warming, has led to sea levels 10 to 20 metres higher than they are now.
But it's not evoking the concern you would expect from those sorts of figures.
Well, there is a great deal of concern out there in the community. I mean, people see that bushfires are getting more intense and frequent, that droughts are getting worse, that heat waves are getting more intense and frequent. There is a great deal of concern out there. There was a lot of confusion. And I think I saw one poll that said that there were about a third of people that didn't even have a clear sense of whether Labor or the Liberals had a stronger climate policy. And I think that there is absolutely no question that scare campaigns on climate policy can work. I think Scott Morrison ran effectively an opposition campaign. He doesn't really have a mandate for anything because he didn't really put anything to the electorate, but he put a great deal out about the policies that he didn't like. And in many ways, I actually think his campaign was reminiscent of Tony Abbott's original campaign from opposition. It had a lot of the hallmarks of that. And this was a campaign in which we saw, flat out untruths about, people being forced to install batteries or, EV charging stations in their houses, or, people being forced to give up their petrol vehicles, which were, provably ludicrous, being disseminated by candidates in this campaign. And the reality is it's just not good for our democracy when politicians can say that day is night and not be held to account for it.
Christine Forster, do you want to respond to that?
Look, I think that scare campaigns aren't new in politics. Look, it's the Medi-Scare campaign just before the 2016 election. But the reality is there was a very clear difference in position from the Prime Minister, the Liberal Party, the Coalition and Labor. It was a very clear difference in position on climate policy. Labor wanted to go to 45% emissions reductions, 50% renewables. The Coalition has committed to the Paris Agreement, committed to those targets and is going about meeting them. And that was the climate policy that the voting public responded to.
Because Myriam, Lyons, in, say, a state like Queensland, that climate change message, that get upwards prosecuting, that just didn't flow through, did it? Because they decided jobs were more important.
Well, just to be clear, we were working in one seat in Queensland, which was Dixon, where we were not predominantly talking about climate change. But
you were also involved in
to the broader question. Not at all, no. But to the broader question of where Queensland is at on climate change, I think it would be a mistake to think that Queenslanders are not concerned about climate change. It is definitely...
But it wasn't the priority they chose.
They voted on other issues, correct. I think that it would be a mistake, however, to think that people would therefore endorse, for example, decisions to allow Adani to pose a threat to Queensland water. There are many graziers in Queensland who are deeply concerned about the potential impact of Adani's mine on water, and that is something that is going to continue to be a great concern. It would also be a mistake to think that this was a ringing endorsement of the coal industry, and you don't have to trust my word on that. Just look at the leaked report from the Queensland Resources Council, which found that the coal industry is deeply mistrusted. Possibly the only thing that is more distrusted in Queensland was Bill Shorten. But there is definitely no licence to let the mining industry rip. It is true that the mining industry can be quite effective in using workers as a kind of human shield to attempt to make governments let them off the hook for the damage that they do to land and water and to our climate. But there is not a mood to allow them to continue without being held to account, without regulation on those issues.
Paula Matthewson, I'm interested in your view on what Myriam Lyons has just been saying about the degree of concern about climate change and whether that plays into the day-to-day issues, as you were talking about jobs and the economy locally.
Well, I think we've seen quite starkly on election night that can very much depend on what part of the country you live in. If you're living in an area that where employment is low, employment is low, yes, unemployment is high, and there's the prospect of turning that around with mining jobs, well-paid mining jobs, then people will be less concerned about climate action and more concerned about getting the jobs. But as we've seen that, and as Christine's also mentioned, if you can afford to be concerned about climate change, climate action, the costs of climate action, the short-term costs of climate action, then a lot of people are, and we see that in the more affluent inner city seats. So there is this huge split between parts, rural and regional parts of Australia, where employment may be low, mining really does mean jobs and a pathway to economic stability, and those in the metro seats that are comfortable, can afford higher electricity or higher electricity costs or whatever the other costs are of climate action, and happy to pay those costs because they know it's contributing to genuine action against climate change.
Myriam Lyons, when you get Queensland LNP members such as Michelle Landry and Peter Dutton thanking people like Bob Brown for their presence in Queensland, for making the divisions just so clear, what is it that went wrong there, that failed to connect with people in Queensland, voters in Queensland, to give them a clear alternative?
Look, again, I would say that, the factors in Queensland probably come down far more to a whole bunch of different factors. It would be incredibly simplistic to put that down solely to that convoy. And I would also say that, really the dominant theme that is coming out of, what was going wrong for voters in their minds about what the offering was on the other side from Scott Morrison was really down to the pitch and to the salesperson, not to the policies.
In Queensland, Christine Forster, the Adani mine really is for central and north Queensland. It symbolises so much more than just the jobs that would come with that mine, because it's not a huge number of jobs, but it's more about what it represents, isn't it? So you saw Michelle Landry in Capricornia have a 10% swing towards her. You've picked up the seat of Herbert, Flynn and Hinkler also saw a swing towards the LNP. People just said, we want the jobs that are associated with this mine. Essentially, that's right. People are more at the end of the day, and rightly so, people are more concerned about having a job than a nebulous idea of climate change if they don't see it actually impacting them, and that's human nature, and it's perfectly natural.
What do you say? Sorry, can I just ask you, just before we come to you, Myriam, what do you make of that point? That this has been made in the media by politicians, that people locally in Queensland didn't even know what they were voting for because there are not a huge amount of jobs associated with this mine, and all the damage to the Great Barrier Reef would outweigh all those benefits. What do you say about that criticism?
Well, if people have voted to protect jobs and industry, that's the message that they heard, obviously.
They've done so deliberately.
Yeah, and that's right. And people will always protect their livelihoods and the future of their children, the opportunities that their children and their grandchildren are going to have, and that's the message that they were hearing. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's a massive challenge for us to ensure that development of coal mining in Queensland has the least possible impact on the environment overall, and it's the responsibility of both the state and the federal government to ensure that mining is conducted safely and sustainably, to both provide the jobs and the export revenue that we need as an economy, but also to protect our beautiful and pristine environment and, you know, our World Heritage sites like the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, you know, that would be a monstrous loss to the world if there was, you know, any more damage done to the Barrier Reef. And that's the responsibility of regulators to ensure that mining is conducted safely.
Your reply, Myriam?
And sustainably.
Well, if you want to save the Great Barrier Reef, you have to stop digging up and burning coal, which is the number one cause of climate change, which is the number one threat to the reef. That's absolutely clear. I think probably the other one thing I would say is that any politician who is telling workers in central Queensland that coal is going to be delivering long-term jobs of the future for them is offering them false hope. Like, Adani has been absolutely clear that they plan to automate their mining program from pit to port. Like, they have said that publicly, and that is a broader trend in the mining industry as a whole. And global investment is shifting incredibly rapidly away from coal and into renewables.
So why is that why is that not resonating then?
I think probably a lot more work needs to be done to actually tell that story on the ground in the communities that are affected, and also a lot more work needs to be done for governments to fess up, be honest, actually agree that, OK, well, taking climate science seriously means that we need to phase out fossil fuels. Doing that means that we need to offer real hope and a real plan for transition for those communities, because anything else is completely disingenuous and is just offering them false hope.
Paula Matthewson, Labor's primary vote in Queensland was 27%. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's a reflection of the fact that Labor was never comfortable with its position on Adani. Well, not only was it not comfortable, but it wasn't even entirely honest with its position. It really did play two sides of the coin. So it was kind of against Adani, or not convinced about Adani in those affluent seats, particularly in Victoria, where people wanted this genuine action on climate change and see Adani as the symbol of that either occurring or not occurring. So saying Labor was giving that message in Melbourne and then was trying to give another message in Queensland, in saying, oh, we're all for jobs, and that includes the jobs that will be created by not only Adani but the whole Galilee Basin. You know, there's more than one coal mine that's proposed for that area, and it does mean a lot of jobs in the short term in terms of developing those mines before they're even operational. So in this modern day, I mean, 10, 20 years ago, Labor may have gotten away with that, but now, when you say something in Melbourne, they hear about it in Toowoomba almost instantaneously, and they really didn't get away with it, and that added again to this being unsure about Bill Shorten, and you know, they felt that he wasn't really particularly truthful.
And Cathy O'Toole was just really quite wishy-washy in her responses to about whether she supported Adani or not.
Yeah, you saw that interview on News Breakfast with Michael Rowland, where he asked her several times just to come out and say, I support the Adani mine, and she couldn't do it in a simple statement.
Look, I think Paula is absolutely right that Shorten was trying to play it both ways on Adani, and if you compare that to, say, the stance that Hawke took on the Franklin Dam, where it was absolutely unequivocal and they lost some seats in Tasmania in that election and gained a whole lot more in other places, because people in those other places were absolutely clear on where they stood, and it was quite clear in the lead up to election day that I think that Bill Shorten was equivocating on whether or not he really wanted seats in Queensland or Victoria. In reality, in the long term, you know, we cannot sustain a community and we cannot have a safe climate that is going to preserve jobs in all of the other industries like agriculture, like tourism, that are affected by climate change, if we continue with the politics where you just divide the country in half so that you can pick the bigger half. That is not sustainable, and we are going to need to come up, any responsible government is going to need to come up with a policy for sustainable long-term jobs in all the areas of Australia.
Paula, can I ask you about some really fascinating pieces in the New Daily in the last 24 hours around this idea of polling? Because there's been a lot of criticism that the polls got it right. I mean, the view I have is that they were all over the place. So they were not only wrong, they were completely inaccurate. So you had Labor's internal polling that was patchy. The Liberals had an inkling about a week out roughly that they were going to possibly win, that they were an upward trajectory. The Union polling showed the ALP was not making it across the line. There were a lot of undecided people showing up in the polling, and that bears out in the low primary vote, particularly for Labor. And that's despite all the published newspaper polls that had Labor consistently in front. What on earth went wrong? And ultimately, how useful is polling?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a clear-cut answer for you either. My colleague at the New Daily, Samantha Maiden, ran with an amazing story today, which basically said that Labor was using the same company for its internal polling that the Murdoch press used for Newspoll. So it's hardly surprising that Labor didn't exactly know what was going on, because the same company was apparently running two separate polls, but still coming up with the same results. And you know, it will really come down to the pollsters, I think, to tell us what's wrong, because it comes down to methodology. And you know, there's this talk of the shy Tory, which came up in Brexit, came up in the
United
US.
States with Trump.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right. So people are apparently too embarrassed to tell pollsters that they will vote Conservative. And so I think it's probably partly that. Maybe people are sick of polls, you know, really don't treat their answers particularly seriously. There's also the methodological problems with people not having landlines anymore, so depending now on mobile phones. So there's all sorts of things that are involved.
Can I ask you this? Is it reasonable to expect that a poll will predict a result?
Well, statistically, yes. Well, a poll can tell you what is happening at the point of time that the poll was taken. And then you can take your chance at extrapolating from that. So, I mean, pollsters will say to you, I guess quite wisely, that no, they won't predict. But you can extrapolate from them. But we've now seen that not only do polls not actually accurately measure what is happening now, so they're just making it completely nonsensical to try and extrapolate anything from there.
Christine Forster, have you seen that people, when it comes to polling, are too embarrassed to say that they vote for the coalition?
Not that I'm aware. People usually tell me pretty straight up which way they're going to vote. But, I mean, even the exit polls, the early exit polls on Saturday were completely wrong. So there was just this mindset, I think, that's come through in the polling, that Labor was a shoo-in and that we were gone for all money, and had been for the last 3 years. So it's an extraordinary result in that sense, and I guess all the pollsters out there have to really go away and have a good hard look at their methodology, because they were consistently getting it wrong. So.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe Paula Matthewson might have a view on this as well, but Christine Forster, I'd like to hear from you first. This idea that the coalition represented traditional social values, and that particularly in electorates that had high ethnic communities, that was something that they were looking for, and so you saw swings in those seats because of that?
I don't think so, actually. This election, I think, was fought on the grounds of higher taxes, bigger spending, and I think ultimately it came down to people not wanting to trust Labor with their money.
What does that say about the future of politics if a party, in this case Labor, but in the future possibly a coalition government, cannot go to an election with a big picture outlook, something visionary that people always say they want out of politics, for fear of rocking the boat too much?
Well, I think the coalition did go to this election with a vision, and it was spelled out pretty clearly on budget night. And that was that this is an economically responsible government that wants to make sure that we get the economy right, so that people and their children and their grandchildren will have an equality of opportunity. And that was very clear, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister campaigned on, and that's what he's going to deliver.
But the message was also that this is not the time for change, it's time for more of the same.
Well, the message was you need a safe pair of hands, and people weren't prepared to give Bill Shorten. They weren't prepared to risk a Shorten government. They weren't prepared to hand over their money and trust Bill Shorten that the government knows best. That's what it came down to.
Paula Matthewson, your response?
Well, I think back to Kevin Rudd's successful campaign in 2007, and he basically said, I'm John Howard but younger, and I will ratify Kyoto. He basically ran with that. I mean, he had other policies, but he ran a campaign that wasn't to scare the horses, wasn't to scare those Howard battlers. Said, I'm basically like him, but I'm the upgrade. And I think that's why people were comfortable in voting for him. Now, it was a different set of circumstances when Tony Abbott won the election, but I think Labor this time should have done something similar in just not going out with so much information. Basically it was like a fire hydrant for voters. It was just too much information. They closed down to an extent and just went with the devil they knew. And instead they...
But also, Paula, how much of it was that people just simply didn't like Bill Shorten?
Oh, I think that was part of it, yes. Comparing Shorten with, Shorten's no Rudd, that's certainly the case. He didn't have that sort of popularity. But if they just run with a couple of big ticket visionary issues, stuck to that, just as Scott Morrison did, sticking to a few key messages, Labor probably should have done the same and might have had more success.
Myriam, Lyons, big ticket issues, things like climate change, too dangerous to take to an election these days?
Well, I think that actually now you're seeing a few Liberal people speaking out and saying that they recognise that climate change is an incredibly serious issue and they are going to need to improve their policy on it. And I wish them well with that internal battle, and I hope that the balance is tipped further in their favour by the absence of Tony Abbott from our parliament.
What impact will that have, Christine Forster? Because Scott Morrison, he now has this mandate, this blank slate, and he has also doesn't have Tony Abbott in the parliament anymore to potentially put hurdles in his way.
Well, I don't think Tony was putting hurdles in Scott Morrison's way, to be honest. Tony argued his convictions in the party room, just as everybody else does. The reality is that there's always a range of views within parties, and it's good and healthy democracy that those views are aired, and that governing parties, take a look at all sides of a problem before coming up with a policy to tackle it. And I think Scott Morrison will do that in a great way, and I have no doubt personally that yes, climate change will be on the agenda, and that the Morrison government will go about tackling it in the best and most sensible way.
How consistent is that with still embracing the idea of Adani, coal-fired power stations, and staying inside the Paris Agreement and bringing down emissions at the same time? I mean, that sounds like such a broad church. It's almost very difficult to accommodate.
Well, the economy, the business sector and the economy is doing it anyway. This is what's happening, and people are seeing that a newer, sustainable future is what we all need, and businesses are taking steps themselves. They don't necessarily need a big stick from government to do the right thing. They are doing it already.
Well, they keep on calling for certainty in climate policy, and you're already seeing some statements coming out from key business groups actually saying, well, we're going to need more than what the Liberals are currently offering. So I think there will be a lot of pressure on the new Liberal government to do that.
Well, certainly it was very clear that when the coalition when Scott Morrison went into the election, that we will stand by our international commitments under the Paris Agreement, and that we will meet them. And that's what the policy is, and that's what we'll go about doing, I'm sure.
Myriam, Lyons, how much did GetUp spend on this election campaign, and will it reassess how it is involved in political campaigns from now on?
Well, our real power comes from people, not from money. And if it just came down to who had more to spend, we would not have any impact at all, particularly in Warringah, where, Tony Abbott was listed at having around $1 million to throw at that campaign. I can tell you that we had a hell of a lot less than that. But what we did have was thousands of people giving up their weekends, giving up their evenings to have heartfelt conversations with their fellow voters about the climate crisis, why they were worried about the kind of world their grandkids might inherit if we don't do more to preserve a living and livable planet for them.
Christine Forster, the government has benefited from Clive Palmer's generosity in spending that much money on what, 60, 70 million dollars?
50 million, I think it was. Yeah.
On advertising. Is that the future that you can
I hope
kind
not.
of? I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, the party has benefited ultimately from that, hasn't it?
Well, look, preferences of a couple of percentage point of preferences have flowed.
But also that messaging not to vote Labor.
Well, look, you know, if Clive Palmer's got $50 million he wants to throw into an election campaign, he's perfectly entitled to do so, I suppose. But you know, I guess it was a contributory to the "Don't Trust, Shorten" message, but ultimately, you know, Palmer hasn't shown to have much influence because it was a very small result for him. He hasn't won a Senate seat for $50 million. So it's not terribly significant. And let's hope that, you know, we don't see that as a new trend in politics, and that we don't see, I mean, if GetUp is going to go out and campaign the way they have in this federal election, they need to be put on the register as a political party, and they need to be accountable just the same way as the major political parties are, because they are a political party.
Christine Forster, can I just ask you a very quick question? You, I know, have come around very recently to this idea of maybe the Liberal Party needs quotas in Parliament. You've got, I think, 5 new women coming in, which
terrific.
constitutes, I think, 20% of the new sitting members in the coalition. Is this the time now to start implementing quotas of women in government, in ministerial positions?
Yeah, look, I think it's been well recognised internally in the Liberal Party that this is a problem. That you know, that whilst we don't have increasing representation by women, there's a danger that we will be perceived as not being representative of the community, and it's not. It's, you know, and that would be a true perception.
What to do about that?
Well, as I've said, you know, I'm coming around to the idea that we need to be putting in a quota and saying that in every pre-selection we need 50%. We need equal numbers of men and women standing for pre-selection, and I think certainly that would encourage more women to put their hands up for pre-selection, and it's only going to boost the numbers of women, you know, ultimately representing the coalition in parliaments. And this is parliaments at all levels, you know, federal, state, local government. We need more representation of women in the Liberal Party at all three levels of
ministerial
government.
positions now for this government?
Yeah, well, look, I think there will be Linda Reynolds, I understand, is going to be the new Defence Minister. That's a terrific appointment, and she's such a talented woman. So, yeah, it's clear that there's going to be more women in Cabinet, and that's a fantastic thing.
Christine Forster, you were at the Manly Village Public School on Saturday. You spent the whole day there campaigning for Tony Abbott. All of his sisters were booth captains, he mentioned in his speech. What will Tony Abbott do next?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer, to be honest. You know, he is still a man with, you know, he's very fit. He's got a great deal of energy. He's got, you know, a massive intellect. I'm sure he will not be disappearing off the public stage completely. But I think for the moment he'll probably just be riding his bike and working volunteering for the Rural Fire Service and hanging out at Queenscliff Beach for a bit. So.
Will he stay in politics?
Well, he's no longer the member for Warringah, so I don't think that there's any pathway for him to remain in politics in a formal way. But
how does he feel about his place in commentary about politics?
His
place in commentary, offering commentary about politics.
Oh, I'm sure he'd probably rather write the book than have it written about him. But I suspect that he probably. I imagine there will be a book at some point. You never know. He's a journalist by profession, so he loves to write, and he's written several books already. And I'm wouldn't be surprised if there was a book on its way at some point in the future.
All right, Christine Forster, Myriam, Lyons, Paula Matthewson, it's terrific to have you all on the program. Thank you so much for coming in and joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.